In today's programme, where does the European Parliament fit in the EU's post-Lisbon architecture, and how does it relate to other institutions? I'll be talking to a leading MEP about one hoped-for change. How can the EU secure its energy supplies and end its dependence on Russian gas? And the issue of freedom of movement between Switzerland and the EU gives rise to friction. Hello and welcome to Europal TV News. The Lisbon Treaty has changed the interrelationship of the EU institutions, and there are still some points to be resolved. Arno de Mulder's report on the European Parliament's place in the new power structure is read by Lavinia Hoyos.
In the EU, it takes three to tango, with the European Commission, the European Council and the European Parliament. But the Parliament doesn't want to be the third wheel, which means there's no shortage of disputes. In February, MEPs didn't hesitate in rejecting SWIFT, which aimed to share banking data with the USA. In his role as conductor, Jerzy Buzek, President of the European Parliament, uses all his influence to increase the political weight of the MEPs.
Another important point is our access to some documents which are necessary for Parliament if we want to answer all the political and questions on the content of legislation.
Just before his inauguration, José Manuel Barroso made many promises. He recalled the importance of better cooperation between the three European power players. An agreement must now be finalized between the Commission and the Parliament.
It must help us to fashion a new culture of partnership and purpose, to use our common leverage to offer a real advance for the European project.
Two new players enter the game for the EU. Catherine Ashton, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and Herman Van Rompuy, President of the Council. These new positions open up new perspectives.
We would like to cooperate smoothly with the European Council and to prepare a similar framework agreement with the Council.
Negotiations look set to be tough.
After a row between Russia and Ukraine left thousands of Europeans without gas, the EU has been looking into ways to diversify and to secure its supplies, reducing Europe's dependence on Russian gas. Hugh Weinstock prepared this report.
Lithuania celebrated 20 years of independence from Soviet occupation. However, the figures paint a different picture. This country remains 100% dependent on Russian gas supplies. Today, the Industry Committee looked to resolve Europe's dependency problem through solidarity. The proposed regulation hopes to develop the internal market and put into place special crisis measures so that European consumers will not have to go without. East-West solidarity comes in the form of sending surplus gas back to the countries if a crisis should occur via a reverse flow system.
In the Yamal pipeline, gas flows from Poland to Germany, but there is no reverse flow. Now, with this regulation, this reverse flow will be installed.
Gas supply diversification with a trio of new gas pipelines, Nord Stream, South Stream and Nabucco, are proving divisive themselves. The bilateral projects run contrary to the solidarity principle. Nabucco bypasses Russia completely and aims to supply 5 to 10% of Europe's gas. But some MEPs have their doubts.
The role of the Union is not, as I understand that, to politicize those economic projects. I'm not sure there's going to be enough gas for Nabucco. I would like to see that succeed. But that's not a political decision, obviously.
Between economic and political actors, Europe may need to wait some time before Energy Independence Day. But whether this law will come into effect before another crisis happens is another story.
Earlier, we heard about how the Lisbon Treaty is changing things. It may also give more investigative powers to MEPs. Yesterday, I spoke to the member drafting that report. David Martin, Labour member for Scotland in the United Kingdom, member of the Constitutional Affairs Committee. You're preparing a report on the powers of committees of inquiry, and you believe that this now has the facility for being changed because of the Lisbon Treaty. In what way?
Well, the Lisbon Treaty itself only allows the European Parliament to propose new rules for committees of inquiries, but the European Parliament has held 3 committees of inquiries. We've had one on the transit regime, one on BSE, and one on equitable life. And at the end of our report on equitable life, the committee were very critical because they found, I have to say, my own member state, they found officials sometimes not prepared to come and give evidence. They found that access to documents weakened, and generally the right to inquire didn't seem to be as strong as we felt a parliament should have. So, Committee of Inquiry we've used on a very limited basis, only 3 times in the whole history of the European Parliament, but the powers are just not adequate. So we want to investigate the fact that the Lisbon says we can rewrite the rules to start the process to see if we can get agreement on rewriting the rules.
I'm sure most MEPs would agree with you that committees of inquiry should have more power to summon witnesses and to summon papers and documentation. You still got to get it past the Council of Ministers.
Yes, and that will be the big trick, because Lisbon actually also gives us the power to summon witnesses, but it doesn't actually give us the power to do anything about it if they don't turn up. And there we need the support of the member states. And we haven't formally discussed this in committee yet, but my tentative approach to this is to say that the European Parliament should get the same powers as the national parliaments. So we want the member states to agree that, say, the House of Commons has an absolute right to bring witnesses in the United Kingdom, we should have the same right. If, and excuse my ignorance here because I don't know if this is true, but say the Latvian Parliament doesn't have the same right, then clearly we shouldn't have the same rights. We shouldn't have rights above the Latvian Parliament to call Latvian witnesses. So it's about giving us the same status as a national parliament in terms of our ability to call witnesses and to get access to documents. It's not a perfect solution because it still means it would be uneven in terms of getting our evidence, but it would be an improvement on the status quo.
Council won't like it, though.
It's going to be a hard battle, no question about it.
David Martin, thanks very much indeed. Well, it's time now for our regular look at today's other news stories in brief, and we start with the decision taken at the UN Wildlife Meeting in Qatar to reject the proposed ban on exports of bluefin tuna. The idea, proposed by Monaco and backed by Norway, Kenya and the United States, had EU support for delayed implementation. But Japan, Canada and poor nations successfully argued it would adversely affect fishing communities.
Athens puts the pressure on. Greek Prime Minister Papandreou went before the Parliament's Special Committee on the Financial Crisis. Faced with strict measures to reduce the budget deficit, Athens wants to know whether the EU will help or not. The message from Germany this morning was reluctance to help. Athens is warning that without clear support from the EU, the country could turn to the IMF in Washington, which would be an embarrassment for the Union. The saga continues at the EU summit on Greek debt next week in Brussels. A question of weeks. MEPs want to extend maternity leave from 14 to 20 weeks. They're also pushing for a 2-week paternity leave. A study on the financial impact of these measures is underway. The vote scheduled for May could be delayed. Music for freedom. It's already 20 years since Lithuania escaped the Soviet grip, and the Parliament marked the occasion in style. It became a member of the European Union back in 2004.
After controversial election campaigns in Switzerland and the ban on the building of new minarets, problems are arising over the free movement of EU workers there. This report was prepared by Maria Maggiore.
What's up in Switzerland? New waves of protectionism after the contested referendum last November about the ban on building minarets in mosques. This time, it's the turn of European workers who feel discriminated against when trying to enter Switzerland. The current controversy is mostly about the so-called 8 days rule, a period of time that Swiss cantons apparently need to check on the workers. The problem is that most of the time it's about urgent services like boiler or roof maintenance, and a period of 8 days in standby would mean losing the job. Swiss representatives have been invited to a public hearing at the EU Parliament today for the first time ever. They can hear the Europeans' discontent and set out their reasons.
There are certain problems. For example, when it comes to the services, we have problems about the so-called supporting measures, where the Swiss cantons and the government wants to defend itself against social dumping. This is understandable, but sometimes these measures are not proportionate.
In 2008, every working day, more than 300 new people came to Switzerland to work. But there are only 10 Swiss people going the other way per day. This agreement works in a very asymmetric way.
But Europeans are not satisfied. They fear that today it concerns only temporary workers, but tomorrow other professionals will face closed doors too. At a legal level, Switzerland doesn't risk too much. It's neither part of the European Union nor of the European Economic Area, unlike Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein. However, because of its 120 bilateral agreements with the European Union, Switzerland is almost like a member state, even if one with many exceptions and derogations.
Well, that rounds off today's programme. You can keep up to date with our news on europaltv.eu, and of course, please join us again next time. But for now, goodbye from Brussels.